They laughed the moment they saw her name on the audition list. But less than 10 minutes later, some of the most arrogant people in the music industry would be too stunned to speak. The backstage hallway of the Manhattan Arts Theater buzzed with nervous energy as contestants adjusted sequin dresses, rehearsed vocal runs under their breath, and filmed polished social media clips for millions of followers. Bright white lights reflected off marble floors while assistants rushed from room to room carrying clipboards and bottled water. Everyone in the building was chasing the same dream tonight. Fame, recognition, a second chance at relevance. And then there was Claire Bennett, sitting quietly at the far end of the hallway in a cream-colored sweater and dark jeans. She looked nothing like the others. Her blonde-brown hair was tied back in a loose, low ponytail, and her hands rested calmly on a worn leather folder sitting in her lap. No entourage, no makeup team, no camera crew following her around. Most people who walked past her assumed she was someone's aunt waiting for the show to end. Vanessa Cole certainly did. The celebrity judge glanced down at the contestant list while sipping espresso from a paper cup, her sharp green eyes suddenly narrowing at one particular name. Claire Bennett, she repeated slowly before letting out a quiet laugh. Ethan Brooks looked over from the judge's table, where he was scrolling through rehearsal notes. "Wait," he said, leaning closer. "That Claire Bennett." Vanessa smirked. Apparently she thinks this is some kind of comeback. A few nearby assistants exchanged awkward glances. Even years later, the name still carried whispers through the music industry. Claire Bennett had once been called the voice of a generation. At 27, she had sold out theaters across the country with a haunting blend of classical vocals and modern ballads. Critics compared her to legends. Producers fought over contracts. Then, almost overnight, she disappeared. A scandal exploded online accusing her of lip-syncing during a nationally televised charity performance. Headlines tore her apart within days. Sponsors vanished. Radio stations stopped playing her music. The internet moved on without mercy, and Claire Bennett was never seen again. Until tonight. Vanessa flipped through the folder again with visible amusement. "I thought she lost her voice after all that." Ethan chuckled. "Maybe she's here for closure." Nearby contestants overheard the conversation immediately. Whispering spread through the hallway like electricity. Some pulled out their phones, pretending not to stare while secretly recording reactions. Claire remained seated quietly, her eyes lowered toward the floor. But the slight tightening of her fingers around the leather folder betrayed what she was feeling inside. Humiliation had a sound. It lived in muffled laughter, in sideways glances, in people pretending you no longer existed while talking about you loud enough for you to hear every word. A production assistant suddenly approached Claire without making eye contact. "You'll be last," she said quickly before walking away. Claire looked up softly. "I thought my slot was at 7:40. Schedule changed." The assistant shrugged. "You can wait if you want." Another contestant nearby smirked under her breath. Claire nodded politely anyway. "Thank you." Vanessa watched the exchange with cold satisfaction before leaning back in her chair. "This should be interesting," she muttered. But what none of them understood yet was that Claire Bennett had not walked back into that theater to reclaim fame. She had walked in carrying years of silence, heartbreak, and truth inside her chest. And before the night was over, the very people mocking her would remember exactly what real talent sounds like. The longer Claire Bennett sat alone in that backstage hallway, the more the building seemed determined to remind her that she no longer belonged there. Contestants passed by in glittering gowns and expensive tailored suits, their voices echoing against the polished walls as they compared streaming numbers, celebrity followers, and brand deals. Every conversation sounded louder whenever someone glanced in Claire's direction. Some recognized her immediately. Others only knew fragments of the story. But all of them carried the same curiosity people, reserved for fallen stars. What really happened to her? Did she actually fake her performances? Why did she disappear? Claire kept her eyes lowered, pretending not to notice the whispers circling around her like cold air. 10 years earlier, she had walked through backstage hallways just like this one, while photographers chased her for interviews and executives begged her to sign contracts. She remembered the warm glow of theater lights reflecting off polished pianos. She remembered crowds standing before she even finished singing. More than anything, she remembered her father waiting in the wings every single night with the same quiet smile on his face. "Do not sing to impress people," he used to tell her. sing so honestly that they forget themselves for a moment. Back then, Claire believed music could heal almost anything. Then came the scandal. The charity concert had been broadcast live across the country. Halfway through her performance, audio engineers claimed the vocal track and microphone feed did not match. Within hours, television hosts mocked her. Bloggers called her a fraud. Headlines exploded online accusing her of deceiving millions of fans. No one cared that Claire denied everything. No one cared that the investigation into the technical malfunction quietly disappeared weeks later. The damage had already been done. One public humiliation was all it took for an entire industry to erase her. Her record label dropped her within 48 hours. Tour sponsors vanished overnight. Friends stopped returning calls. Claire still remembered standing outside her apartment building while reporters shouted questions through camera flashes bright enough to hurt her eyes. Did you fake your career? Was your talent ever real? Are you finished? She had not answered a single one. Instead, she disappeared from public life completely. For years, she taught beginner piano lessons to children in a small music shop outside Albany. She avoided interviews, avoided television, avoided hearing her own songs played in grocery stores and coffee shops because the memories hurt too much. Yet despite everything, she never stopped singing. Not once. A stage manager suddenly appeared near the hallway entrance holding a clipboard. "Claire Bennett," he called out impatiently. Claire stood immediately. "Yes." The man barely glanced at her. "There has been another change. You are now closing the entire audition block." Ethan Brooks overheard from nearby and laughed under his breath. "Perfect," he muttered to Vanessa. "Might as well end the night with a little nostalgia act." Vanessa smiled thinly while adjusting the diamond bracelet around her wrist, assuming she can still hold a note. Several contestants chuckled quietly. Claire heard every word. Her face remained calm, but inside, old wounds reopened with brutal precision. The cruelest part about humiliation was not the insult itself. It was how quickly a room full of strangers could decide who deserved dignity and who did not. Claire slowly sat back down in the corner chair as the theater lights dimmed beyond the hallway doors. Somewhere inside the massive auditorium, another contestant finished their performance to polite applause. The sound echoed faintly backstage before fading into silence again. Claire reached into her coat pocket and gently touched the small silver ring that had belonged to her father. Her breathing steadied. Then, for the first time that night, she quietly whispered to herself, one song. Just one honest song. By 9:30 that night, exhaustion had settled over the Manhattan Arts Theater like heavy fog. Contestants who had once strutted confidently through the backstage halls now sat slumped against walls, scrolling nervously through their phones, waiting for callbacks that might never come. Makeup had begun to fade. Forced smiles had disappeared. But Vanessa Cole remained energized. Public humiliation was entertainment to her, especially when the victim used to stand above everyone else. She sat behind the judge's table beneath the cold white stage lights, reviewing Claire Bennett's file again with growing amusement. "I still cannot believe she actually showed up," she said loudly enough for nearby staff members to hear. Ethan Brooks leaned back in his chair with a grin. "You know what would make this even better?" he asked. "Give her something." "Impossible." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "Impossible how?" Ethan flipped through the music catalog on the table before pulling out a thick sheet of paper. "This." Vanessa's expression brightened instantly. It was an advanced vocal arrangement of Stars Beneath the River, one of the most technically difficult songs ever performed in modern crossover music. The song demanded flawless breath control, massive vocal range, and emotional precision. Younger singers often avoided it entirely because one mistake could destroy the entire performance. Vanessa smiled slowly. "Cruel," she whispered. Ethan shrugged casually. "If she still thinks she belongs in this industry, let her prove it." Nearby, a production assistant hesitated. "Should we at least warn her beforehand?" Vanessa looked up sharply. "Why?" "Professionals adapt." The assistant fell silent immediately. Power in the entertainment industry rarely needed to shout. It simply reminded everyone who could be replaced. Minutes later, the assistant approached Claire backstage carrying the sheet music with visible discomfort. "The judges selected your song," she explained softly. Claire accepted the pages carefully. The moment she saw the title, her eyes froze for half a second. "This arrangement?" she asked quietly. "Yes." "There is no rehearsal track?" "No, ma'am." Claire nodded once. I understand. The assistant lingered awkwardly before lowering her voice. For what it is worth, I do not think this is fair. Claire looked at the young woman and offered a faint smile that carried more sadness than anger. Fairness left this industry a long time ago. The assistant did not know how to answer that. Across the hallway, several contestants noticed the song selection and exchanged shocked reactions. No way, one whispered. That song destroys professionals. Another laughed nervously. Maybe that is the point. Claire walked slowly toward an empty practice room near the end of the corridor. Inside, a single dusty piano sat beneath dim yellow lights. The room smelled faintly of old wood and worn fabric, untouched by the glamour filling the rest of the theater. Claire placed the sheet music on the piano stand and stared at it silently. Memories returned immediately. Years ago, this exact song had nearly become her signature performance before the scandal destroyed everything. Her father used to play the piano accompaniment late at night while she practiced until sunrise. Do not fear difficult music, he once told her while smiling gently across the piano keys. Fear singing without truth. Claire closed her eyes tightly as emotion threatened to overwhelm her. For one dangerous moment, doubt crept back into her chest. Maybe Vanessa was right. Maybe the world had moved on. Maybe her voice belonged to another lifetime now. Then she heard faint laughter echoing from the hallway outside. Ethan Brooks. This is going to be painful, he said to someone nearby. The words hung in the air long after the footsteps faded away. Claire slowly sat down at the piano bench and pressed one trembling finger against a single ivory key. The soft note filled the empty room like a ghost from another life. And somewhere deep inside her silence, something finally began to wake up. The theater audience had grown restless by the time the final audition slot approached. Empty coffee cups sat scattered across the judges' table, while producers whispered impatiently near the lighting booth. Most of the crowd expected the evening to end quietly with another forgettable performance before heading home into the cold Manhattan night. No one realized they were seconds away from witnessing something that would stay with them for years. Backstage, Claire Bennett remained alone in the small rehearsal room with the faded piano and dim yellow lights. Her fingers rested motionless above the keys while the sheet music lay open in front of her like a challenge from the past. She had attempted the opening phrase 3 times already. Each time, old fear tightened around her throat before the first line could fully escape. Not because she had forgotten how to sing, because she remembered too well what happened the last time the world listened. Outside the room, footsteps approached. The door opened slightly, and a young production assistant peeked inside. It was the same girl from earlier, barely older than 22, with nervous eyes and a headset slipping off one shoulder. Miss Bennett. Claire looked up softly. Yes. They need you at the stage entrance in 5 minutes. Claire nodded once. The assistant hesitated before stepping fully into the room. I know this is probably inappropriate, she said carefully, but my mother used to play your music every Sunday morning when I was little. Claire blinked in surprise. The young woman smiled shyly. She said your songs made the house feel peaceful. For the first time that night, something in Claire's guarded expression shifted. Not pride, not relief, something quieter. The assistant continued softly. She cried when you disappeared. The room fell silent after those words. Claire looked down at the piano keys, her throat tightening again. For years she had convinced herself that nobody truly cared whether she sang anymore. The industry had certainly moved on fast enough. But hearing that somewhere, inside ordinary homes she would never see, her voice had mattered to people, that pain cut differently. Thank you, Claire whispered. The assistant gave a small nod before stepping back toward the door. For what it is worth, she added, I hope they remember who you are tonight. Then she disappeared into the hallway. Claire sat alone again as distant applause echoed faintly through the theater walls. Another contestant had just finished performing. She stared at her reflection in the dusty piano lid for several long seconds. Time had changed her face. Softer lines around the eyes. More sadness in the silence between breaths. But beneath all of it, the same woman still remained. The same woman who once stood beneath stage lights believing music could tell the truth when people refused to. Slowly, Claire opened the leather folder resting beside the piano bench. Inside were old newspaper clippings, faded concert programs, and one photograph folded carefully in half. Her father stood beside her backstage after her very first sold-out performance at Carnegie Hall. He was smiling proudly while she laughed at something outside the frame. On the back of the photo, written in his uneven handwriting, were 6 simple words. "Sing honestly, and they will listen." Claire closed her eyes tightly as emotion rushed through her chest. Then the overhead speaker crackled alive. Claire Bennett to stage entrance. Claire Bennett to stage entrance. The moment had arrived. Somewhere beyond those walls, Vanessa Cole was likely preparing another sarcastic comment. Ethan Brooks was probably expecting a public collapse entertaining enough to laugh about later over expensive drinks. They believed they had already written Claire's ending years ago. That was their mistake. Because the most dangerous thing about quiet people is that the world often forgets they are still carrying a voice. The stage entrance corridor felt colder than the rest of the theater as Claire Bennett walked slowly toward the glowing red curtain at the end of the hallway. Every step echoed softly against the polished floor while muffled audience chatter drifted through the walls ahead. A stagehand clipped a microphone pack carefully behind her sweater without saying much. Another checked the lighting marks taped across the floor. No one treated her cruelly anymore. That was the strange thing about public humiliation. Once people decided someone was already broken, they no longer needed to push. They simply waited for the collapse. Claire stood quietly near the curtain while the previous contestant finished receiving polite applause. Across the stage, Vanessa Cole leaned back in her chair with visible boredom while Ethan Brooks whispered something that made 2 producers laugh softly. A giant digital clock above the theater entrance read 10:14 p.m. Most of the audience looked exhausted. Some were already gathering coats and handbags, assuming the night was basically over. Claire noticed all of it through a narrow opening in the curtain. The impatience, the indifference, the certainty that nothing memorable was about to happen. Then the stage manager approached holding a clipboard. "You have 90 seconds maximum," he said briskly. Claire blinked once. The audition guidelines stated 3 minutes. "Schedule changed," he replied without emotion. 90 seconds. Claire understood immediately. Vanessa was tightening the trap. "Understood," she answered softly. The manager walked away before she could say anything else. Behind the judges' table, Ethan glanced toward the curtain and smirked. "This should be quick." Vanessa crossed one leg over the other elegantly. "Honestly, I almost feel bad." But she did not. People who enjoyed power rarely did. A production assistant handed Claire a small paper cup of water. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted it. Suddenly, all the years between her old life and this moment seemed to disappear at once. The screaming reporters outside hotel entrances. The headlines calling her fake. The silence of empty apartments after everyone stopped calling. Nights spent teaching children simple scales while pretending she no longer dreamed about stages. Fear rose inside her chest so suddenly that for one dangerous moment, she considered walking away. No performance. No humiliation. No reopening old wounds in front of strangers who had already judged her before she sang a single note. The easiest thing in the world would have been to disappear again. Then she heard her father's voice in memory, so clearly it almost startled her. "Fear is loud, Claire. Truth is quiet." Her breathing slowed. Across the hallway mirror, she caught her own reflection beneath the pale backstage lights. No glamorous gown. No celebrity styling. Just a tired woman in a cream sweater standing alone moments before facing an audience that expected failure. Yet something about that image suddenly felt stronger than the version of herself that once filled magazine covers. Because back then she had sung to protect a career. Tonight she had nothing left to protect. The theater lights dimmed fully. A hush rolled through the auditorium. The announcer's voice echoed warmly across the speakers. "Our final performer of the evening, Claire Bennett." The reaction was immediate. Murmurs spread across the crowd like wind moving through dry leaves. Some people recognized the name instantly. Others looked confused before quickly searching online. Tiny phone screens glowed throughout the audience as old articles and scandal headlines resurfaced in seconds. Vanessa smiled faintly while adjusting her pen, already prepared to press the rejection button the moment things went wrong. Ethan folded his arms confidently. The curtain began to open. Claire stepped forward into the blinding white stage lights while thousands of eyes fixed directly onto her. And for one suspended heartbeat, the entire theater waited to watch a fallen woman fail one last time. Claire Bennett stood alone at center stage beneath the blinding white lights, while the massive auditorium watched her with the cold curiosity reserved for people expected to fail publicly. The microphone waited inches from her face. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera zoomed closer. Vanessa Cole glanced down at her judging sheet with visible impatience while Ethan Brooks folded his arms confidently, already prepared for awkward notes and shattered nerves. Even the pianist seated beside the grand piano looked uncertain as he adjusted the sheet music in front of him. Claire could feel thousands of eyes measuring her silence. Waiting, judging, remembering old headlines instead of the woman standing before them now. For a long moment, she said nothing. The theater grew increasingly uncomfortable. A cough echoed somewhere near the back row. One audience member shifted in their seat. Another whispered quietly, "Does she even remember the lyrics?" Vanessa tapped her pen against the desk with growing amusement. But Claire was not frozen by fear. She was listening to her own breathing, listening to the silence between heartbeats, listening to the part of herself she had buried beneath years of shame and public rejection. Slowly, she turned toward the pianist and gave a small nod. The first piano chord drifted softly into the theater. Low, delicate, fragile enough to break. Claire closed her eyes for one final second. Then she sang. The first note did not explode through the room. It did something far more powerful. It stopped the air itself. Every whisper vanished instantly. Ethan's smirk disappeared before the second word even left her mouth. Vanessa's pen froze mid-movement above the judging sheet. The pianist looked up sharply from the keys, stunned by the control and depth in Claire's voice. It was not simply beautiful singing. It was honesty shaped into sound. Years of heartbreak moved through every note with breathtaking precision. The richness of her tone filled the massive auditorium effortlessly, wrapping around marble walls and crystal lights like something alive. Audience members who seconds earlier had been checking their phones slowly lowered them into their laps. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Nobody dared interrupt what was happening. The room had gone completely silent. Claire continued into the next phrase with flawless control, her voice rising higher now, carrying pain without ever losing elegance. The impossible arrangement Ethan selected as a trap suddenly sounded effortless in her hands. More than effortless, necessary, as though the song had been waiting years for its rightful owner to return. A producer seated near the front leaned forward in disbelief. "That is impossible," he whispered under his breath. Near the back of the theater, an older man wearing silver-framed glasses slowly stood from his seat. His eyes widened with recognition as emotion crossed his face. Martin Keller, one of the producers who had worked on Claire's original records years earlier. He stared at the stage as realization hit him with brutal clarity. "My God," he murmured softly. She never lost her voice. Beside him, another executive looked confused. Martin swallowed hard before answering quietly. "We destroyed her career over a lie." On stage, Claire sang the chorus with such haunting emotional force that several audience members visibly wiped tears from their eyes. Even contestants backstage had gathered near monitors, completely speechless now. The same people who laughed at her hours earlier stood frozen in stunned silence. Vanessa Cole slowly lowered her pen onto the table. For the first time that night, uncertainty appeared in her expression. Because deep down, she realized something terrifying. This was no comeback attempt. This was judgment. And every arrogant person in that theater could suddenly hear exactly what they had done to her. Claire Bennett stood perfectly still beneath the stage lights as the final chorus rose through the theater with breathtaking clarity. Every note carried the weight of years spent in silence. Not bitterness, not anger, something deeper. The sound of someone surviving humiliation without allowing it to destroy their soul. The audience could feel it now. That was why nobody looked away anymore. Her voice moved through the auditorium with impossible control, powerful without force, emotional without desperation. Even the musicians seated behind the stage curtain stared toward her in disbelief. Ethan Brooks slowly leaned forward at the judges' table, his face drained of confidence. The difficult arrangement he had selected as a trap was unraveling him instead. Claire was not simply reaching the notes. She was transforming the song into something raw enough to expose everyone listening. Vanessa Cole kept her expression carefully composed, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Because for the first time in years, she could feel an audience slipping beyond her influence. Claire no longer looked like a washed-up singer begging for relevance. She looked untouchable. Somewhere near the center rows, a woman in her 60s quietly began to cry. Her husband squeezed her hand gently without taking his eyes off the stage. Two teenage contestants backstage stood frozen beside the monitor screens, whispering to each other in disbelief. "That cannot be live," one murmured softly. The other shook her head slowly. No recording could sound like that. On stage, Claire reached the final bridge of the song, the section most vocalists feared because it demanded absolute emotional vulnerability. Years ago, producers used to beg her to tone it down for commercial audiences. Too emotional, they said. Too real. But tonight there was no producer controlling her voice. No contract. No pressure to become marketable. Just truth. Claire opened her eyes slowly as she sang the next line, and for one brief moment her gaze drifted directly toward Vanessa Cole. The room seemed to hold its breath again. Not because Claire looked angry. That was what made it unbearable. She looked wounded. Human. And somehow still graceful despite everything they had done to her. Vanessa's throat tightened unexpectedly. Memories she had spent years burying suddenly resurfaced without warning. The late-night industry meetings. The executives searching for someone to blame after the technical disaster during the charity broadcast. The decision to let Claire take the fall publicly because protecting the network mattered more than protecting one singer. Vanessa had known the accusations were exaggerated. She had known Claire never truly deserved the destruction that followed. But staying silent had been easier, more profitable, more convenient. Now, sitting beneath the cold theater lights while Claire's voice echoed through the auditorium, that silence suddenly felt ugly. Martin Keller rose slowly from his seat near the back row, unable to remain seated any longer. The respected producer stared at the stage with tears gathering in his eyes. "We abandoned her," he whispered quietly. Nearby audience members overheard him and exchanged stunned glances. Phones that once searched scandal headlines were now recording the performance with trembling hands. Social media feeds exploded in real time as clips spread across the internet faster than anyone inside the theater could understand. Claire Bennett is singing again. She sounds unbelievable. The industry lied about her. The tide was turning right in front of them. But Claire seemed completely unaware of it. She was no longer singing for approval. She was singing like someone finally setting down years of pain she had carried alone. The final note approached. Ethan Brooks unconsciously lowered his eyes toward the desk, unable to hold onto the smug confidence he wore earlier. Vanessa sat frozen in absolute silence. And across the entire Manhattan Arts Theater, thousands of people waited breathlessly for the ending of a performance none of them would ever forget. The final note left Claire Bennett's lips like a prayer finally released after years of silence. It floated through the theater with haunting purity before dissolving into absolute stillness. No music followed. No movement. The massive auditorium sat frozen beneath the white stage lights, as if the entire building had forgotten how to breathe. Claire lowered her gaze slowly toward the stage floor, her chest rising gently with controlled breaths while the silence stretched longer and longer. Ethan Brooks stared at her with parted lips, unable to speak. The rejection button beneath his hand remained untouched. Vanessa Cole sat perfectly rigid at the judges' table, her carefully polished image cracking beneath the weight of what had just happened. Around them, audience members looked at one another with stunned expressions, searching for words that did not exist yet. Then someone stood. A man near the center aisle rose first, clapping slowly with tears visible in his eyes. Another person stood beside him. Then another. Within seconds, the entire theater exploded into a standing ovation so thunderous it shook the walls. The sound crashed through the auditorium like a wave breaking after years held back. Contestants backstage erupted into disbelief while stagehands stared open-mouthed from the wings. Several audience members wiped tears from their cheeks openly now, no longer embarrassed by emotion. Claire remained motionless beneath the lights as applause roared around her. Not triumphant, not arrogant, just overwhelmed. She had imagined this moment many times during lonely nights over the years, but reality felt strangely quiet inside her chest. Because applause could not erase what happened. It could not return lost years. It could not undo humiliation. But it could reveal truth. And tonight, Truth had finally become louder than scandal. Martin Keller made his way toward the front rows with visible urgency, his face pale with regret. "We need to say something," he whispered toward Vanessa. She did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained locked on Claire. For years, Vanessa had built a career shaping narratives, deciding who deserved redemption and who remained disposable. But now she understood something deeply uncomfortable. The woman standing on that stage had carried herself with more dignity and silence than most powerful people ever managed with influence. Ethan finally leaned toward his microphone, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Claire," he began, his voice unsteady. The audience quieted instantly. Ethan swallowed hard before continuing. "That was one of the most extraordinary performances this theater has ever heard." Claire looked toward him calmly, but said nothing. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. "I misjudged you." The words sounded painfully small compared to the damage behind them. Vanessa slowly reached for her microphone next. Her usual confidence had disappeared completely. "Years ago," she said carefully, "many people in this industry failed you." A hush settled across the theater again. Vanessa's voice softened. "Tonight reminded us what real artistry sounds like." Claire listened quietly without expression, because apologies offered after public victory always arrived too late. The audience erupted into applause again, louder this time. Phones filled the air, recording every second. Social media feeds across the country exploded with clips of Claire's performance, but none of that seemed to matter to her anymore. She stepped closer to the microphone one final time. The theater immediately fell silent again. Claire's voice, now soft and almost fragile after the performance, carried effortlessly across the room. "I did not come here tonight to become famous again," she said gently. "I came because I needed to sing honestly one more time." Tears filled several faces throughout the crowd. Even some contestants backstage began crying quietly. Claire offered a faint, grateful smile toward the audience before stepping back from the microphone. And in that moment, the people who once ignored her finally understood the difference between someone chasing attention and someone carrying truth. The standing ovation continued long after Claire Bennett stepped away from the microphone. People remained on their feet as though sitting down would somehow diminish what they had just witnessed. The applause rolled through the Manhattan Arts Theater in powerful waves while camera flashes lit the audience like scattered stars. Producers rushed through the aisles, speaking urgently into phones. Social media notifications exploded across screens nationwide. News outlets had already begun reposting clips of Claire's performance, with headlines calling it the greatest comeback in modern music history. But Claire barely noticed any of it. She stood quietly near the edge of the stage, blinking against the bright lights as emotion settled slowly through her chest. Not victory, not revenge, relief. The kind of relief that only comes when a person finally stops carrying the weight of other people's lies. Vanessa Cole rose carefully from the judges' table and walked toward the stage with visible hesitation. The audience gradually quieted as they watched her approach. Hours earlier, Vanessa had looked at Claire with amusement and dismissal. Now there was something else in her expression. "Shame, Claire," she said softly once she reached the stage steps. Claire turned toward her calmly. Vanessa seemed to struggle for the right words. "I should have defended you years ago," she admitted quietly. A stunned murmur spread across the theater. Vanessa lowered her eyes briefly. "A lot of us knew the investigation into that broadcast was incomplete, but protecting the network was easier than protecting one person." The honesty landed heavily in the silent room. Claire looked at her for several long seconds. Then she answered with remarkable gentleness. "People become cruel when fear matters more than truth." Vanessa's eyes filled with tears she clearly had not expected. Ethan Brooks remained seated behind the judge's table, staring down at his hands in silence. For the first time in years, the people with power looked painfully small beside the woman they once ignored. Martin Keller stepped forward next, emotion visible across his face. "Your old recordings never stopped selling," he said quietly. "People never forgot you, Claire. We just let louder voices bury you." Claire offered him a faint smile, but there was sadness inside it. Sometimes silence buries people faster than lies. The room went still again. Somewhere backstage, contestants who once mocked her now stood speechless near the monitors. One young singer quietly removed her own makeup wipes from her bag and began crying softly. Another whispered, "I hope I never treat someone like that." Because that was the real thing changing inside the theater now. Not careers. Character. Claire looked once more across the massive auditorium filled with strangers standing shoulder to shoulder beneath glowing chandeliers. Some faces were tearful, some ashamed, some inspired, but all of them were listening now in a way they had not listened before. She gently removed the small silver ring from her pocket and held it in her palm for a moment beneath the stage lights. Her father's ring, the same one she touched backstage when fear almost convinced her to walk away. Claire closed her fingers around it softly before stepping back from center stage. "Thank you for listening tonight," she said quietly into the microphone. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the backstage curtain alone. No dramatic farewell, no demand for redemption, no celebration, just quiet dignity. The audience remained standing as she disappeared from sight. Outside the theater, snow had begun falling softly across the Manhattan streets, covering the sidewalks in silver white beneath the city lights. Claire stepped through the side exit wearing the same cream sweater she arrived in hours earlier. No security team followed her. No reporters reached her yet. For the first time in years, the night felt peaceful. She paused briefly beneath the falling snow and looked up at the dark sky above the glowing city skyline. Somewhere far behind her, applause still echoed faintly through the theater walls. And that night, an entire industry remembered something it had forgotten a long time ago. Real greatness does not beg to be seen. It simply waits for the world to become quiet enough to hear it.